Ready? Say cheese.
Hey, what's up, YouTube? So, I just finished playing the game SOMA for the third time, actually. And I've told many people to play it. And if anybody who's watching this right now, if you haven't played it, go play it. Because honestly, it's easily one of the top 3 games, in my opinion, ever created. And after playing it the third time, and still loving it as much as I did the first time, I would go so far as to say that it very well could be the number 1 game on my list of greatest games ever made. And that's saying a lot. I've played a lot of different games over my life. But there was one major thing about SOMA that I wanted to sort of put out there, and I didn't realize that it was actually something that was so heavily disputed, which is this whole idea of the coin toss. And I think that it was something that was put into the game to describe a certain situation to the character, and it was also a way to describe something to the player. And one could argue that it was done in a bad way because it adds to confusion. However, that is part of the whole narrative of the game. And you have to sort of look at it as a whole. Now, I'm not saying that I'm going to solve the riddle per se at the moment, as in like people that would argue the point to me, or anybody that would have my opinion of the quote-unquote coin toss in the game. I'm not saying that I'm going to end this dispute with this video, but I am going to give you some pretty irrefutable evidence in regards to why I think that there actually is no mystery to this. And Frictional Games did a really good job of making that extraordinarily clear. So the idea is that there's a coin toss, because Catherine said this to Simon at some point in the game. In fact, maybe a few times, or at least it's referenced a few times, but she says it specifically to him. When talking about when the copy of his brain comes into existence in the form of whatever. Now, if we look at the game, there's 4 different Simons. There's the original Simon back in 2015. There's the first Simon you wake up as in Upsilon. There's the second Simon that you're transferred, or the third Simon rather, sorry, that you're transferred to in Phi, I believe it was. And then there's the 4th Simon, who is the Simon that's on the Ark. So that's very direct. And in fact, the game is in the process as like, kind of like, sorry, as like showing you the entire time how this all works through Catherine. So you meet Catherine. She's a part of like, her chip, her Cortex chip is in the machine on the ground. You then, like, she turns herself off and spits the chip out in mid-sentence, and then you pick it up and put it inside the Omni tool on the computer, and she finishes her sentence. She comes online finishing that sentence. And she does this, I think, another time or two. I can't really quite remember, but she even explains in the game. He asks her, like, what is it like? Is it like you're going to sleep or something? And she says, no, not exactly. Like, there's accounted for sort of time lost, right? Because she's aware that some sort of time must have passed because she's no longer in the same space. So she knows that Simon has picked her up, let's say, from Lambda, and then put her over in Theta, for example. And like, she knows that she's in a different space. So she knows that some amount of time must have been, like, has passed. But to her, it's seamless. And to the player, it's seamless. Because that's part of the whole way of getting the player to understand that narrative. Because the ideas that SOMA are trying to tackle are actually quite out there and thoughtful and complex ideas, right? It's an idea of transhumanism. It's an idea of consciousness. It's an idea of continuity. It's an idea of, is there an afterlife, right? It asks all kinds of questions. The game is very, very deep and profound. And one of the things that adds to its depth is most times where you're discussing this, when the idea of all these things are put forward, if they're put forward through a discussion, there's only so much that each person can really take the discussion to, especially when it starts to turn into like sort of like a debate. And then you're sort of discussing antics. You can't really get to the point of the experience of these things. And the same thing kind of holds true to if you were to read a book of the story of Soma. It wouldn't really translate too well, in fact, and you wouldn't have such a profound feeling of that experience because books just don't work that way. And even cinema, which can come a little bit closer, right? Like the book would actually literally ask you the question, like tell you, ask this question, right? In your mind. A movie might show you things that kind of make you feel a certain way, but a video game can really cause you to experience it, like Soma did, and then it causes you to ask the question for yourself. And that's why this is so profound, and that's why exactly the way that they did it is how it had to be done, in all kinds of ways, including, which is another side note where people argue whether or not the game should have horror. The game had to have horror. The game had to have WoW in order to get you to understand what artificial intelligence is and the reality that it's never going to be human. So, in effect, the second Simon, the third Simon, and the fourth Simon will never truly be human. That's what the WoW represents. It's a misunderstanding of what it is to be. The WoW is trying to keep everybody alive because it doesn't quite understand. It understands only in its directive as to what to be means. What being alive means, what being human means. So it's just trying to preserve life. And it does this in all these ways, and it ends up making abominations. It's the same way that the copies of Simon are abominations in and of themselves in a way. Because it starts to take what it is to be human, which is this idea of living and then dying, and then whatever you want to take from there after that, whatever. And it continues it on. It starts to fuck with the continuity of things. So when you're in the process of kind of experiencing this in the game, you are, because it's the only way that it can be done. That's the thing. That's why there's a little bit of confusion with this. So when you're Simon in 2015, and then all of a sudden you quote unquote wake up as Simon in 2105, I think it was. Like the Simon in the future, the second Simon technically. When you kind of go from one to the other, it seems kind of seamless, right? Like at one point you were getting your brain scanned in the doctor's office, and then the next thing you know, you're in this room. That is exactly how that copy would feel, because the copy ends there. It's a snippet in time. It doesn't experience the rest of that original Simon's life. And that's shown in the game. He finds like where the copy is, and he realizes that there's audio files that are things that happened after. Like he doesn't remember those things himself because he wasn't there for that. But he was there for everything before that. All of 2015 Simon's life leading up to that brain scan, he was there for that. He experienced that. That's the copy of that entirety. And then he continues in his life of, being in the underwater science facility. And it leads all the way up to the point of where he's in Phi, and then like he copies himself up until that point, and then downloads that copy into the new body with the suit in order to go into the abyss at Phi. And again, the player experiences this seamlessness, where like it's just like he got teleported or something. He's at one point, he's sitting in that chair. Next point, he's in the other body, but then he hears himself in the other room. And Catherine goes on about this thing, trying to explain to him the coin toss. Now, what does the coin toss really mean? Some people think that it's a terrible analogy as to what's going on, and Frictional Games kind of mess that up. I totally disagree. I think the coin toss analogy is a perfect one, and even though a lot of people want to see themselves as completely understanding the whole situation, I have yet to actually find anybody else but one friend of mine in particular, and somebody that I had read something about that they had written online. So really just two people that fully grasp the entirety of what's going on in this game. The rest, that I've seen, like, they kind of understand it, but there's a lot of confusion there. And that is Simon. That's why Simon is an incredibly realistic character. Catherine explains to Simon multiple times what's going on, and you as a player in turn are being explained multiple times, and there is no mystery. It's an extraordinarily direct thing. This is not the original. This is a copy. The original is gone. The original is not transferred over. There is no transferring. She even says that. He says, like, isn't this like a brain transplant? She says, no, I've told you so many times this is a copy. And there's really no other way to explain that. It is actually that direct. And like I said previously in this video, it's even shown to you through the existence of Catherine. You pick her up, you put her down. She discusses how that continuity works for herself. There is no difference. There's no difference in regards to how that continuity would work for the player as they're going through it. So the reason why it would have to be that way is because that's the only way that you as the player would be able to experience how it feels to sort of just, quote unquote, again, big heavy quotes, wake up as the new version, the copy. Because there is no waking up. It's a direct continuation of that moment when the scan was complete. Once the scan is complete, wherever the hell it, quote unquote, wakes up, it's just boom, switching a channel. But the observer's still watching the TV. You know what I'm saying? Like, it just switches to a new program. You're switching to a new location, a new time, a new space, and continuing on from there. So the actual, like, coin flip that people get hung up on, it's not that it doesn't exist. The coin flip does exist, but the coin flip is not to see whether or not the Simon that got scanned is going to transfer over to the new copy of Simon or not. That's not what the coin flip is. The idea of the coin flip and winning or losing the coin flip starts to get a little bit confusing because it depends on what you actually want. So in the case of us the entire time in the game, we're trying not to die. But we also want to be the original. We want to be the real Simon. Well, the real Simon dies. And he dies young. He dies only a few months later, a year later, whatever it is, to his brain scan. Back in 2015. So that's not a successful one. However, he is the original Simon. He's the real deal. The most real, arguably, than any of the rest. And that is what we want. So in one way, he wins the coin toss because he is what we want to be, which is real. The original. But he loses the coin toss because he dies early. Now, the two Simons in between, Simon 2 and 3, technically they both lose the coin toss. But if we get deeper down and actually look at it, when Simon 2 gets copied and then Simon 3 gets activated, one could say that Simon 3 won the coin toss between the two of them. Not that the coin toss took place there. It's just that, imagine it more like this. There is an infinite amount of possible consciousnesses. Because the consciousness itself is not the brain scan. This is an interesting thing even in real science, by the way. Like, they don't actually know the you that exists doesn't actually exist in the brain. So in other words, really quickly, you could say that your brain can sense drinking orange juice, but it's you that decides whether or not you like orange juice or not. Your brain actually doesn't decide that. Your past experiences technically don't even really decide that. They can affect it, and your brain's perception of orange juice can affect whether or not you like it or not, but ultimately the you that makes the decision as to what you like and dislike, all these different things, the you that you think exists in your brain actually technically doesn't really exist in your brain. That's the consciousness that at the moment, like in current 2019, we can't really account for what the hell that is. And that's what SOMA is actually kind of discussing. That's one of the many things that SOMA tries to discuss in its game. So when you're talking about Simon sort of waking up and winning the coin toss, you have to imagine that there's all these other consciousness, infinite amount of possibilities of the observer, the perception, the consciousness entering in this particular instance being activated. And that's a coin toss. But whether or not heads or tails is the winning coin toss, well, that's up to debate the entire time. That's really up to debate. Again, it's one of the questions that it asks you. Do you favor being more real? Is being the original Simon, the original you, the most important part of your journey in any sort of life? Because if that's the case, then you played that character. It was at the beginning of the game. That was as good as it was ever going to get. And that character won the coin toss. The three other Simons that exist, the two in the middle and the one that ends up in the arc, is the one that lost the coin toss, because they're the consciousness that when they decided to be activated, that's not what you wanted. Or perhaps what you want is to be able to exist on the arc for an incredibly long time. You want some sort of form of quote-unquote immortality. You just wanted to extend your life even further. Well, in that case, the original Simon lost the coin toss, because when he entered the world, when he was born into being a real human, and the coin was flipped as to which consciousness is actually going to experience this version of Simon's continuity, it lost. Because if that's what you want as the observer, well, you're not going to get that. Maybe. Right? Because there is this idea of afterlife and so on and so forth, and I'm not going to get into the discussion of all that. That's not the point of this. The point is to focus in on this game in regards to what the coin toss is. So if that's what you want, to ultimately end up in heaven, end up in the ark, well, the first, the second, and the third Simon lose the coin toss. And ending up on the ark, the fourth Simon, that's the consciousness of the infinite possibilities of consciousnesses out there. That's the one that wins. All the other ones lose. Or you could look at it that the second Simon is the one that won, because he has some sort of closure. Or perhaps the first, second, and third actually have some sort of closure in that regard, so they are the winners. Like, it can get really, really kind of convoluted, because it's so dependent on what you actually desire as a person, and that's very individual to you as the player. So the idea of the coin toss, yes, it does exist, and the way that Catherine stated it to Simon, it does exist in that way. She was correct to say it to him, but his interpretation of it was incorrect. And that incorrect interpretation is what leads a lot of players, plus the idea that they are actually experiencing a constant stream continuity throughout the whole game between all different versions of Simon. It leads them to believe what Simon is also being led to believe, which is that he will eventually get on the ark. But that's not the way that this works. It never worked that way. There's absolutely nothing in the game whatsoever that leads anyone to believe that any of that is going to function that way. In fact, it is constantly told that it is not going to work that way, and you constantly have many, many different scenarios that show you that it does not work that way. Funny enough, though, it's still not enough for most players out there. They still, even all of that after experiencing it, are confused by the situation. And that is exactly what Frictional Games wanted to create. It's a work of genius. It's a work of amazing, high-level art that talks about incredibly complex and high-intelligence topics that honestly most people don't quite get. If you don't believe me that most people don't quite get it, even the people that believe that they do get it don't really quite get it. Look at how well the game was. It's sad that that game is not as unbelievably more successful than it is. I think Frictional Games barely made back their money on that, and it has caused that company to reevaluate the way that it's going to put out games, which is incredibly fucking depressing as far as I'm concerned. Because I think SOMA is honestly at the moment the apex of their work. Amnesia was okay. I think it gets way too much credit, in my opinion. Although it was leading towards it, I think Penumbra, the whole Penumbra series, was far superior to Amnesia, but dated, and most people graphically, and most people didn't really get into it because of that very reason. But it's better than that. And then Amnesia is a mixture, like everything they had learned up to that point, and then this amazingly complex topic, and they tackle it with unbelievable precision. Everything about that game is tackled with serious precision, and it's honestly a video game that should be marveled, but it's not. It's just kind of tossed to the side because most people don't understand actually what the hell's really going on, and it leads to all these different levels of confusion. A lot of people, even I think the vast majority of people, just wanted another Amnesia. They just kind of wanted to get scared, and the horror that's in that game is what's, I guess you could call, quiet horror, but it's also, there is some very direct horror. But I've heard people complain about, like, well, I don't like the monsters in that game because eventually they just become tedious. Yeah, no shit. They're supposed to become tedious because that's the way video games are. Most horror games, eventually, if the monster's kind of after you for any given period of time, like, it loses its effect on you. Like, at the beginning, it's very intense. You're looking around, and then later on in the game, if it's not some jump scare that really hits you, you're kind of just like, well, I've seen and done and whatever. Let's just get on with this. You're no longer really afraid of anything, and that's not realistic to real life. Like, real life, you're actually worried about your mortality, so you wouldn't put yourself into those situations. Well, in SOMA, that actually plays to its benefit, whereas for most video games that wouldn't work out too well, because it's just like, I can't believe this. In SOMA, that part of you that can't believe this anymore is exactly what the hell would be happening to the character Simon in this scenario anyways. Because he's coming to terms with the fact that he's not real anyways. He's just a copy. He's just kind of like an elaborate artificial intelligence. He's in a robot. He's in a corpse robot type of machine. I mean, he's not really in any sort of danger because he's not the original. And that's usually what most of us would kind of consider as the important part of that, right? And so it becomes more just frustrating to deal with the monsters at times, especially later in the game than it is earlier in the game. And that all totally makes sense. And, you know, that's just like, that's what I mean. Like, the game is amazingly well done. And I wanted to put this video out there as almost like a semi-love letter to Frictional Games, and specifically that game, SOMA, because it is such an amazing gem. And it is very sad if Frictional Games decide to kind of give in to, which you understand why they would have to, because they're a company, they're trying to make money. All of them are trying to make a living. But they're going to have to give in to the masses. And honestly, a game like SOMA is too high level stuff. It's too high level of a topic for the majority of people to appreciate and understand. And so they're going to have to dumb down their games, and they said that they're going to, like, separate their games. You know, they're just going to do horror and then, like, other things and whatever, but they'll never blend them together. And that's really sad, because, like, it's the blending together that causes this game to be such a wonder. And I'll give you the perfect example of this. The whole time you're sort of sitting there and wondering whether or not, like, it's a good idea to be a copy or to be, like, whatever your existence is. And at the same time that that's happening, and you're questioning, like, am I human? Is this important? Is this the way that life is supposed to be? Is this the way that I am supposed to be? Meanwhile, you have the WoW, which is complete artificial intelligence that, again, like I said earlier, is confused as in a way as to what is to be. And that's the horror that comes out of that game, like the monsters that are there, the horrors of people being put on, like, a life support sort of thing when they really should be dead, and how it breaks their psyche and all these things. That's very horrific, dark as fuck shit. And it's all because the artificial intelligence does not quite understand what it actually is to be human and to be alive. And that same statement could be said about Simon 2, 3, and 4. And that's the profoundness that's there. So when you take that out of the game, when you don't have that exist anymore, it just kind of, it's not like the whole story falls apart, but it does dumb it down. So the future games of Frictional Games is going to be a little bit, we'll see. I really hope that they sort of stick to their guns a little bit and just kind of truck forward if they're going to continue. Otherwise, just drop the whole thing and just kind of become, you know, lost in the video game mediocrity, because there's just, you know, maybe there is no place for those types of games. But I personally am going to be, you know, extremely disappointed by that. So anyways, I just wanted to put that out there. Hopefully some of what I said clarifies some of the stuff about that game. It's actually not very complex at all. It is very, very straightforward. It does trigger complex thought. It does make you become thoughtful, and you can perhaps become lost in that, but that's for other reasons, not actually what's going on. So yeah, if you want, play the game again. If you've never played the game, I urge you to go play it. Hopefully I haven't ruined anything here for you. Honestly, I probably have. I'll put a little spoiler thing at the beginning of this video. And that's it. Take it easy.